The sun was sinking low over the ridge, spilling gold and copper across the sky until it bled into the darkening blue. The land seemed to breathe under it, slow and patient, every shadow stretching like the limbs of something ancient. A lone road cut through the dust, winding toward a house that stood against the horizon, weathered boards, a roof patched more than once, and windows catching the last light as if holding it back from night. Two figures moved along that road. The taller walked with a steady, deliberate gait, boots scuffing against the earth without hurry. Beside him, a boy kept pace, though his steps were lighter, hesitant, his small boots lifting small clouds of dust that hung in the still air. The wind moved in low, restless breaths, carrying the faint smell of sage and the distant echo of a crow's call. The boy's gaze stayed on the ground in front of him. Even so, the weight in his eyes could be felt, as if it pulled his shoulders forward. He didn't speak for a long time. The rancher didn't press him. They walked like that, with a quiet stretching between them until it was almost a third presence. When the boy finally spoke, it was low, so low the wind almost took it before it reached the man's ear. "Can you take her instead of me?" The rancher's steps didn't falter. His eyes stayed fixed ahead, on the ranch that grew larger with each pace. He didn't ask who the boy meant. He didn't say yes. He didn't say no. Only the crow's caw broke the stillness, the sound pulling up from the ridge like a note from some dark hymn. They reached the yard as the sun dropped fully, and the sky turned the color of cooling embers. Somewhere, a horse shifted in its stall, hooves shuffling over wood. The boy stopped at the edge of the porch, waiting. She came not long after. A wagon rattled into the yard, driven by a stranger who didn't linger once she stepped down. The wagon rolled away, leaving her standing in the long shadow of the house. Her dress had once been blue, though the dust had stolen its brightness. The hem was frayed, the fabric worn thin at the elbows. She held a small bundle in her hands, nothing more. Her hair was pulled back, though a few loose strands clung to her face from the road's wind. She didn't look frightened, but there was something guarded in the way she held herself, like someone who had been moved from place to place and had learned not to ask why. Her eyes found the boy first. He didn't meet them. His shoulders sagged, his gaze still on the ground. Then she looked to the man beside him, the rancher. He stood as if he'd been carved from the land itself. Lines set deep in his face, not unkind, but cut by years of wind and sun and long work. He nodded toward the door, without explanation. She stepped toward it, glancing once more at the boy before passing him. Inside, the air smelled faintly of coffee and wood smoke. The walls were plain, the table bare except for a single lantern. A fire burned low in the hearth, throwing a thin warmth into the room. The ranch hands drifted in and out of the doorway, their boots loud on the boards. Some offered a glance and nothing more. Others let their eyes linger, measuring her like a new piece of tack, curious, but with a hint of caution. She met each look without flinching. In the days that followed, she moved quietly through the ranch. She scrubbed the dust from the kitchen floor, fetched water from the pump, learned the rhythm of the meals. She worked without complaint, her hands steady, her steps light. Sometimes she would pause outside, standing in the doorway, just to watch the light move across the land. It was a different kind of silence here than the one she had known before, not empty, but alive, full of wind and birds and the distant call of cattle. The boy stayed apart from her. He ate his meals quickly, never beside her, and disappeared into the barn before dusk. When she tried to speak to him, he would nod or shake his head without lifting his eyes. The rancher noticed. He said nothing, but there was a shift in the way he watched them. When she carried a bucket to the corral, his eyes followed. When the boy returned from the far pasture late in the day, the rancher stood in the yard until he was close enough to see the dirt on his boots. The woman never asked why she had been brought here. The boy never explained. And the rancher, in his way, seemed to live in that silence, as though it were as natural as breathing. One evening, as the last light faded from the sky, she sat on the porch steps with her hands folded in her lap. The day had left the air cool and smelling of sage. The rancher stood nearby, leaning against the porch post, watching the sky turn to deep blue. Inside, the ranch hand's laughter drifted faintly from the kitchen. Out here, the night was slow and patient. The boy sat a little way off in the yard, cross-legged in the dirt, his face tilted toward the stars. They had begun to prick through the dark, small and sharp. The rancher stepped down from the porch, the boards creaking under his boots, and crossed to where the boy sat. The woman stayed where she was, watching them through the dim. The rancher stopped a few steps behind him. The boy didn't turn. His voice, when it came, was the same as on that road, quiet, almost lost to the air. "Can you take her instead of me?" The rancher didn't answer. The wind moved through the dry grass, bending it in slow waves. A coyote's call rose from far off, echoing through the dark. The boy kept his gaze on the stars. The man stood behind him, still as a post in the ground. Somewhere, the lantern in the kitchen flickered, and the fire in the hearth shifted with a sigh. The night closed in around them, holding their silence like something it had been waiting to keep. And that was how the day ended, with the question hanging in the air and the rancher saying nothing at all. Frost clung to the fence rails like thin lace spun by the night, catching the pale light of dawn. The air was sharp enough to turn breath to silver, the kind of cold that pressed close to the skin and lingered in the bones. From the kitchen came the slow hiss of a kettle steaming on the stove, the smell of coffee mixing with the faint sweetness of wood smoke. Outside, horses shifted in their stalls, their breath rising in soft clouds, tails swishing lazily as they waited for the day to begin. She moved through that morning with quiet steps, her sleeves rolled past her elbows, her hair tied back in a way that kept it from her work. She had learned to measure feed by weight in her hands, to carry buckets without spilling, to guide a stubborn animal with patience rather than force. When she lifted the latch to the chicken coop, the cold air stirred their soft clucks into a chorus. From time to time, the rancher would be nearby, though never close enough to interrupt. He'd pass by the corral, his shadow stretching long across the frost, his eyes moving over her in a way that was neither possessive nor idle, more like a man keeping track of the weather. If she noticed, she never said. Among the ranch hands, two had begun to stand out in the rhythm of her days. The older one, Elias, had hair the color of worn rope and hands lined deep from years of rope and reins. He spoke slow, as if words were heavy things that shouldn't be wasted, and offered small pieces of advice without being asked. The younger, Mason, had restless eyes and a way of working that seemed to always be looking for the next thing. He talked more than he needed to, laughed quick, but she could see the part of him that itched for something beyond the fence line. The boy kept his own counsel. He did his chores, carrying water, stacking feed, mending a gate when it splintered, but he moved through the work like a shadow, never standing still long enough to be caught in conversation. He kept his eyes on the ground or the task in his hands, and if she passed him in the yard, he would nod or step aside without a word. At night, when the others gathered inside, she would see him walking toward the barn with his bedroll under his arm. Even in the heart of winter, he chose the cold boards and the sound of horses shifting to the warmth of the house. One afternoon, she found his shirt draped over a fence post, the sleeve torn nearly to the shoulder. The fabric was worn but clean, smelling faintly of the soap she'd used on the washboard days before. She carried it inside, set herself by the table, and threaded a needle. The work was slow, the cloth soft from years of wear. When the tear was closed, she folded the shirt and left it on the step of the barn before dusk. Later that evening, when she passed the corral, she saw the boy wearing it. He didn't look at her, but his fingers brushed over the mended seam once, quick as a breath. The rancher, standing at the far gate, caught the exchange from a distance. His eyes lingered on her for a moment longer than usual before he turned back to the cattle. In the stillness between chores, fragments of her past would slip through without meaning to. She never spoke of it outright, but in the way her eyes searched the horizon or how she hesitated when someone offered her help, there was the shape of something once lost. A set of hands that had let go when they shouldn't have. A door closed without warning. One afternoon, while she was inside setting bread dough to rise, the boy lingered near the porch and caught the low voices of Elias and Mason. They were leaning against the rail, the wind carrying their words just far enough. "You hear what happened back in town?" Mason said, his tone a shade quieter than usual. Elias shook his head, glancing toward the barn. Not my business to spread it. But the way she showed up here, there's more to it. The boy stepped away before the rest could reach him. He went to the barn and stayed there until supper, eyes harder than before. That night, the house felt smaller than usual. The air held the scent of stew cooling on the stove, the fire in the hearth crackling low. She sat in the armchair nearest the fire, sewing by the glow, the thread slipping through her fingers in long, even pulls. Outside the windows, the dark pressed against the glass. The rancher came in quietly, brushing the dust from his sleeves. For a while, he stood by the fire without speaking, the heat painting his face in gold and shadow. Then he sat across from her, leaning forward with his forearms on his knees. This land, he said after a long silence, it doesn't stay the same. It burns in summer, freezes in winter. Some years, it gives more than you can take. Others, it takes more than you can give. She glanced up from her sewing. The thread paused between her fingers. His eyes were steady on the flames. People, he went on, aren't much different. Her hands rested in her lap now, the needle caught in the fabric. And when the season changes, she asked softly. His gaze lifted to hers, holding it for a heartbeat before he leaned back. You make sure you've got enough to last. The words settled between them like embers falling into ash, quiet, warm, with a weight that would not fade quickly. The wind began to rise outside, rattling the shutters. By the time the lamps were turned down, the storm had rolled in full. Rain drove against the roof, the gutters overflowing, wind shoving hard at the boards. The night seemed to lean on the house from every side. It was well past midnight when the door burst open. The boy stood there, soaked through, water running from his hair into his eyes. His coat clung to him, heavy with rain, but there was something clutched tight under it, something he shielded with both arms. The rancher was on his feet in an instant. The boy's breath came fast, not from the run, but from something sharper. His gaze found the rancher's and locked there. There was no word between them, only the storm's roar outside, the dripping of water on the floorboards, and the silent shape of what the boy carried pressed close to his chest. The wind came hard across the plains, tearing at the grass until it bowed low, carrying with it the damp edge of rain. Far above, a hawk drifted in slow circles, its wings steady against the restless sky. The ranch sat under that unsettled air, its fences groaning in the gusts, the barn doors rattling on their hinges. By mid-morning, the boy had slipped away from the yard. The rancher found him in the hayloft, crouched in the far corner where the shadows were thick. His hands were wrapped around something crumpled and wet, the paper worn soft from being opened and folded too many times. The rancher stood at the foot of the ladder, saying nothing. The boy hesitated, his knuckles white, then held it out. It was a letter, the ink smudged in places, the edges softened by rain. The words were rough, pressed deep into the page by a heavy hand. They spoke of debts unpaid, of taking back what was owed, and of finding them no matter how far they'd run. There was no name signed at the bottom, but the weight of it didn't need one. When the rancher lowered the paper, the boy was watching him the way someone watches the sky for the first sign of a storm. Inside, the woman was at the table peeling potatoes, her sleeves rolled up, her hair falling loose around her face. When the rancher placed the letter in front of her, her hands stilled. She looked at it for a long moment before her eyes lifted to his. She told it without excuses, her voice steady though the edges frayed now and again. She had worked for the man who wrote it, the boy's father, not as a hired hand, but in the way a person is kept. She cooked his meals, kept his house, and endured the days as they came, because there had been nowhere else to go. The boy had been a small shadow in those years, running through the halls with bare feet, carrying bruises that never seemed to fade. He wasn't hers, not by blood. She had no right to him except the one she'd taken on herself, the choice to stay when no one else would. She had been the one to hide him when the man's temper rose, the one to sit with him on the back steps at night and tell him there was more to the world than the fence lines of that house. When the boy found a chance to run, she went with him, not because she thought she could save him, but because she couldn't bear the thought of him facing the world alone. Her hands twisted in her lap now, her gaze lowered. "He'll come," she said quietly. "Not for me. For him." The rancher's eyes moved to the boy, who sat near the doorway, his jaw tight. After a moment, she added, almost to herself, "That's why he asked you that day." The rancher didn't speak, and so she went on, her voice softening as if the memory itself were fragile. The boy's first words to him, "Can you take her instead of me?" hadn't been a bargain for his own life. It had been his way of asking the man to spare her from what was coming, even if it meant giving himself back to the man who had raised him. "He's been protecting me," she said, "the only way he knows how." The rancher stood still for a long time, the wind pressing against the walls of the house. Then he picked up the letter, folded it once, and slid it into his coat pocket. After that, he spoke little, but the shape of his days changed. He walked the fence lines twice in one day, testing the rails with his hands. He spent hours in the barn, oiling the rifles, checking the sights. When the wind shifted at night, he would step outside and scan the horizon, his eyes narrowing at shadows that weren't there. Without explanation, he moved the boy's bedroll into the room at the back of the house, the one with only one window and a solid door. He told her to take the smaller bedroom beside it. She didn't ask why. She found her own ways to answer the unspoken thing between them. One evening, when the work was done, she cooked a meal meant for fewer mouths, just enough for him, the boy, and herself. It was simple, fresh bread, beans with bacon, coffee strong enough to cut the cold. But it was set carefully, the plates clean, the fire warm. He sat across from her, the boy between them. It was the first time the boy had taken his place at the table without hurrying through the food. He ate in silence, his eyes flicking between the two of them now and then, as if trying to place what was different. When the meal was done, she mended the rancher's coat, the one he wore for work in the far pastures. The fabric was worn at the elbows, a seam loose near the cuff. She said nothing when she handed it back, and he only nodded, but his hand lingered on it a moment longer than needed. The days stretched, the wind never quite settling. Even in stillness, the air felt as if it carried something ahead of it, a change coming fast. It was near sunset when the sign appeared. The sky was burning out into deep amber, the light spilling long across the grass. She was at the pump drawing water when she saw him, a lone rider on the ridge, far enough that the horse and man seemed cut from the horizon itself. The figure didn't move closer. He only sat the saddle, facing the ranch, the sun setting behind him, so his face was lost in shadow. The wind brought the faint smell of smoke, dry and acrid, as if from a fire miles away. By the time she looked again, the rider had turned and was gone, swallowed by the darkening land. But the smell of smoke stayed in the air, caught in the folds of her dress, in the boards of the porch, as if it had come not from distance, but from somewhere much nearer. The sun was bleeding into the horizon, the whole world washed in deep red, as if the day itself knew it was ending on the edge of something irreversible. The ranch stood quiet, save for the low creak of the windmill and the restless shifting of the horses in the corral. Long shadows stretched across the fence line like fingers reaching for the last of the light. Somewhere, far out in the scrub, a coyote's lonely howl threaded through the wind. The rancher stood at the fence, his hands resting easy on the top rail, his stance loose, but his eyes sharp, fixed on the movement coming out of the west. At first, they were only dark shapes in the shimmer of dusk, the sound of hooves a distant thrum. Then the wind shifted, carrying with it the smell of leather, sweat, and something heavier, the kind of trouble a man could taste before he saw it. The riders came into focus, 6 of them in all, but it was the one in front who held the air around him like a weapon. The boy's father. He reined in not 20 yards from the fence, his horse tossing its head. His eyes were hard, his jaw set. "I've come for the boy," he called, his voice cutting through the quiet like a blade. "And if you've any sense, you'll hand him over without fuss." The rancher didn't move, didn't blink. Behind him, somewhere in the dim porch light, the boy's small shadow shifted. The woman's too, a stillness that was more tension than calm. The man's eyes slid past the rancher toward the porch, and something cruel curled at the corner of his mouth. "Her too," he said, low but clear. You've had your time playing house. I'll be taking back what's mine." That was when the boy stepped forward. Not from a porch, but from the side of the barn where he'd been hidden by the shadows. His boots crunched on the dirt. He didn't look at the rancher or the woman, just straight at the man on the horse. "Take me instead," the boy said, his voice steady in a way that made it sound older than his years. "Leave her." The man's grin deepened, sharp as broken glass. "Still trying to be a hero, are you?" The rancher moved then, only a little, but it was enough to draw every eye. He stepped away from the fence rail and planted himself between the riders and the boy. His voice, when it came, was like gravel and steel, slow and certain. "No one leaves with you tonight." Silence fell heavy after that, the kind that presses against the chest, making it hard to breathe. One of the riders shifted in his saddle, his hand hovering near the butt of his pistol. Another spat into the dirt. The boy's father leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "You think you can stop me?" The rancher didn't answer. Instead, there was the sound of boots on the dirt behind him. First one ranch hand, then another, then all the men who'd worked these lands beside him for years stepped forward. The older hand, the one with silver in his hair and a limp in his stride, took his place at the rancher's right. The younger one, all restless energy, came to his left. None of them spoke, but every man there had his hand close to iron. The boy moved too, not back toward safety, but forward, standing in front of the woman, between her and the danger that had chased them across so much hard country. His shoulders were square, his chin high. Guns glinted in the dying light. Fingers twitched. The air seemed to crackle, and the wind carried the faint, sharp scent of wood smoke from somewhere far off, a reminder that even the land itself could burn if pushed hard enough. The standoff stretched thin. The boy's father scanned the faces before him, and for the first time there was a flicker, not of fear, but of calculation. 6 men against more than a dozen, all ready, all unblinking. The kind of math even the cruel had to respect. He straightened in the saddle, his mouth tightening. "This isn't over," he said finally. His voice was low, but it carried. He gave a sharp jerk of the reins, turning his horse. The other riders hesitated only a breath before following, the sound of their retreat fading into the distance until only the wind remained. The rancher didn't move until the dust settled. Only then did he turn, his eyes meeting the boy's for the briefest moment before shifting to the woman. He said nothing, but something passed between them, a weight lifted, or maybe just shifted into something they could carry together. That night, the fire burned low in the hearth. The boy leaned against the rancher's side, his head heavy with the exhaustion that comes after fear has run its course. The woman sat across from him, the lamplight catching the faintest curve of a smile, not wide, not easy, but real. Outside, the wind moved through the grass like a soft voice telling them the worst had passed, at least for now. And somewhere in the quiet that followed, a truth settled in like a stone at the bottom of a river. Sometimes the people we keep are not the ones bound to us by blood, but the ones who stay when it would be easier to walk away.